Chapter 141. Where are they going? Jack asked, watching Jeremy, Craig, and McKee leaving the ball. His green eyes were concerned. I'm not sure, Max replied, but I think we should do like the kid asked. Keep Mrs. McKee dancing? Keith asked, nodding his head and scratching it. Exactly, Max said, bringing them to the Lady Virginia. Jeremy and Craig walked with McKee as he led them through the crowd. He went out a duplicate set of doors directly across from where the butler announced their presence. Beyond them was a spectacular garden filled with bright green plants and a rainbow of flowers that stretched on forever. A large white marble fountain bubbled crystal clear water, while a naked trumpet-playing cherub danced along the top. He paused his playing to wink at Jeremy and Craig before resuming. The music was melodic and otherworldly. McKee motioned for them to join him, carefully sitting on the fountain's edge. His expression was urgent. Jeremy watched the storm raging outside. It seemed unable or unwilling to touch the pretty garden. Giant swirling columns of sand ricocheted off some invisible barrier. Silent lightning stabbed down from the sky, tearing up quarter-mile stretches of earth each place it struck. Craig nodded at Jeremy, sensing his friend's fear. I know. It's frightening. I hope they can keep your mom dancing, McKee sighed, running his fingers across the surface of the water. It was as crystal blue as his eyes. They have to. Jeremy and Craig glanced behind them. Chris and the others took turns waltzing with the Lady Virginia. She laughed and joked, more at ease than Jeremy had ever seen her. Why is it so important to keep her dancing? Jeremy and Craig wondered. McKee seemed genuinely relieved when JT claimed he didn't know how to waltz, and the Lady Virginia offered to teach him. He studied their movements as she glided across the floor in her eldest son's arms. Chris was an accomplished dancer. Jeremy assumed it was in his gay gene. Craig grinned at the mental comment. Dabney laughed outright, since he was an accomplished dancer too, likewise contending with a budding gay gene. The guests looked at him oddly. Chris threw back his head and ignored them. Jeremy dimmed the mind link so there wouldn't be any more eavesdropping and only Craig could hear him. The butler stood in the corner of the ballroom by a large, ornate door. He kept impatiently checking his gold pocket watch as if he were waiting for something. Jeremy and Craig turned to McKee. Your mom's in danger, McKee said, his eyes clouding. I don't know if we can delay this much longer. Jesus, that bald guy gives me the creeps, Craig exclaimed, pointing at the butler. Please don't take the Lord's name in vain, Craig, McKee said. It isn't a good thing to do, you know. Jesus is our friend. He loves you. Sorry, Craig replied, glancing nervously up at the sky. The bald guy does bug me, though. Me too, Jeremy agreed, his power amplifying his voice. He was speaking and projecting simultaneously. He couldn't seem to remember how not to do that. He wondered if maybe he couldn't separate the two in here, inside his mother's mind. Mr. D makes a lot of people feel that way, McKee offered. Mr. D? Jeremy asked, raising an eyebrow. Is that his name? You sound like you know him. McKee giggled, rocking his legs nervously. I've known him as long as I can remember. How did you get it here? Craig asked. The thought of the butler sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to change the subject. A gnawing sense of urgency played on his bladder, if he even had a bladder in here. The same way we did? Jeremy asked. No, McKee replied. You came in the long way. I came with your mom. With my mom? But how? Craig asked. McKee smiled. I can see and hear things. My grandmother calls it clairvoyance, but she says it's more than that. I have brief flashes of insight, almost like her ability to see the future. But for me, it works best with simple things like games of chance, you know? Like with Dabney's werewolf. Sometimes, if the timing is right, I can go inside someone's mind, like now. It has to be someone waiting for the light. My abilities are tied completely to the light. His expression darkened. We came to help you. My grandmother searched for Gunter Bremen for a long time. He held his hand over Jeremy's head. I can feel your power. It's very strong. Yours must be too, Jeremy concluded, if you're here. It was a gift from the Lord, McKee said. I have to help you destroy the evil one. There were others that needed help too. Like Jeremy's mom? Craig asked. I had to help her, McKee replied. It wasn't her time to go. Mr. D gets impatient sometimes and tries to bring people into the light before their time. Mr. D brings people, Craig began, into the light? Of course, McKee said. It's his job. He gets impatient sometimes. What? Craig started and then swallowed. Does Mr. D stand for? McKee cocked his head. He gazed at Craig oddly. Death, he said. The butler is death? Jeremy cried, standing up. The angel of death, McKee said. He grabbed his wrist and pulled him gently back down. Here, Gabriel's a butler. He comes as different things to different people. They don't even recognize him sometimes, but I do. He can't hide from me. It's part of my gift. He's after my mom? Jeremy asked. We have to do something, Craig exclaimed. We have to stop him. You can't, McKee said. No one can. We can cheat him, delay him, trick him even, but we can't stop him. He's part of the natural order. The rules are strict. Then how can we save my mom? Jeremy asked. Well, that's been easy so far, McKee frowned. Mr. D had to convince her to go since it wasn't her time. He almost did, but I stopped her by the grace of the Lord. We have to keep her busy until she heals enough that Mr. D goes away. It could be a long time. Or it could be right now, Jeremy exclaimed. Are you thinking what I hear you thinking? Craig asked. You bet, Jeremy exclaimed. I can heal her. Did you say you can heal too? McKee asked. The Lord must trust you a lot to give you so many of his gifts. Jeremy growled. The Lord had nothing to do with it, McKee. Bremen gave me these powers and tried to steal my body. It didn't work. See, McKee smiled. The Lord trusted you enough to let you keep them. If you can heal your mom, Mr. D will go away. No problem, Craig said, his eyes filling with victory. Jeremy healed me, and I did die. Well, for about a second, but still. McKee looked at Craig oddly. He reached out and touched his forehead. His irises vanished, and his eyes glowed white for a moment. He raised an eyebrow, and his crystal blue irises returned. Wow, McKee whispered. Many of his gifts for sure. The ground rumbled. McKee looked at Mr. D. Jeremy and Craig watched in fear as the butler's face drew up in a sly smile. He dropped his white gloves on the floor. He flipped the latch on the door, and it began to open. No! McKee cried, bolting back into the ballroom. Jeremy and Craig ran after him. All of the guests in the room disappeared. The purest white light poured from the edges of the opening door. Hey, Jack exclaimed. Where did everybody go? The boys looked at each other. I'm sorry, gentlemen, Mr. D said, clearing his throat. This affair has come to an end. The door flung open the rest of the way with a loud bang. The warm light swirled within, cascading over them. It was brighter than the sun, but they could still look into it. Its warmth was amazing, its promise of peace irresistible. Come, Virginia, Mr. D continued. It's time for you to dance with me now, into the light. Virginia turned toward the boys and smiled. Her grin was equally joyous as it was sad. I have to go now, my darlings, she said, her eyes tearing. I love you. Don't ever forget that, okay? Chris stared at her, dumbstruck. She turned away and walked toward the doorway. What's she talking about? He wondered, his hands on his hips. He wanted to dance some more, maybe with Dabney. Where the hell does she think she's going? Not there, Master Christopher, I assure you, Mr. D replied. Come, Virginia, we mustn't keep Thomas waiting. Thomas? Virginia whispered, drifting along as if entranced. My darling Thomas. Wait, Mr. D, please, McKee cried. Chris, don't let her go into the light. The boys all moved at the same time. They grabbed hold of the back of Virginia's flowing gown and tugged on it. She slowed down, but she didn't stop. Their feet dragged across the floor as she drew them along with her. They pulled with all their strength, straining in their tug-of-war between life and death. This isn't fair, Mr. D, McKee pleaded. On the contrary, McKee, Mr. D replied, holding his skeletal hand up. Ricardo screamed. Mr. D ignored him. I may be impatient sometimes, but I am always fair. Mickey? JT mused. Not Master Mickey? Weird. It isn't her time, Jeremy cried, his eyes glowing brighter as his anger grew. Leave her alone, damn it! Now, none of that, Jeremy, Mr. D snapped, his expression darkening. There's nothing damned about this. Jeremy? JT softly asked. Not Master Jeremy? You let her go right now, Jeremy raged. His feet left the floor as his power continued to build. I'll make you if I have to. Will you? Mr. D's immense voice filled the whole world. He sneered, his irises burning bright red. He shimmered, distorting, and when he focused again, the butler was gone. In his place stood a skeletal figure in a hooded black robe that reeked of decaying flesh. He looked exactly the way Jeremy always thought he would. Do you believe you can fight death? Death? Max cried. Jeremy, estás loco? Pull, Chris cried, fighting the light as its warmth called to him too. Oh God, pull you guys. We're pulling, Jack exclaimed. No, please, Virginia pleaded, struggling forward. Thomas, is that you, my love? No, Jeremy yelled. Mickey jumped up and yanked him back down to the ground. Jeremy glared at him with surprise and anger. I told you, Jeremy, he scolded, shaking his finger. You can't fight him. You can only trick him or cheat him. If the door is open again, your mom's body must be failing. If you can heal her, it has to be now. What about them? Leave us here, Chris cried as he struggled to keep Virginia back. She inched closer to the doorway. Go save Mom. All right, Jeremy cried, closing his eyes. I'm out. He faded away. Wait, Mickey cried, but it was too late. Help us, Mickey, Chris begged. Mickey shook his head. He ran over, grabbed a section of the gown, and pulled. Why did you try to stop him? Craig asked, straining. Is something wrong? Well, I hate to say this, but, man, Jeremy needs to talk to my grandmother. What is it? Ricardo asked. What's wrong? Mickey replied, well, if Virginia dies while you're in here, you're all going to die with her. The boys paused. They looked down at Mickey, shocked. Mickey shrugged. Pull!